Now, I'm kind of excited about this episode because of all the arguments that I hear on the streets of Israel. This is probably the one that I hear more than any other. I mean, I could be talking with a secular Jew, a traditional Jew, an Orthodox Jew, and mind you, I'm Jewish myself. But eventually I get to the same objection almost every time. Jesus can't be the Messiah. Why? Because he didn't bring world peace. He didn't gather the exiles. He didn't rebuild the third temple, and he didn't bring universal knowledge of God. I mean, I've heard this argument so many times I could probably finish people's sentences. Jesus can't be the Messiah because, and then comes this list: world peace, the temple, the exiles, and universal knowledge of God. And maybe you're wondering, where is that rule actually found in the Bible? Because when I was talking with people and they would bring up this argument, I would often say, is that really in the Bible? Is it explicit? Can I find it somewhere? Not the prophecies, not the prophecies that point to Messiah, that rule as a requirement for Messiah. So I start scouring the Tanakh. I'm looking for verses that say that if these things aren't completed, the Messiah is automatically disqualified. And honestly, I could never find it. Now, before people start rushing into the comment section, let me make something clear. The Hebrew scriptures absolutely speak of a future age of peace. They speak about the nations knowing God. They speak about Israel's restoration. They speak about another temple. And I'm not arguing against any of that. My question is a different one. Where does the Bible actually say that the Messiah must accomplish all of those things before he can be recognized as the Messiah? Because that's the assumption behind this argument. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this objection isn't as biblical as people think. So I want to start in the first century. When Jesus lived, what was the biggest objection people had to him? Think about it for a second, okay? The temple was still standing. Okay, the Jewish people were still in the land, so the objection wasn't he didn't rebuild the temple. The temple was already there. The objection wasn't he didn't gather the exiles. The people were in the land. The objection wasn't he didn't bring world peace. The biggest objection was that he was crucified. To Jewish people looking for a Messiah who would free them from Rome, a crucified Messiah sounded impossible. How could God's king be executed by the Romans? How could the Messiah be rejected by so many people? How could the promised deliverer end up hanging on a cross? Now, the people were praying for, hoping for, and expecting victory. They expected a conquering king. Instead, they saw suffering, rejection, and crucifixion, and that was like scandalous to them. It was a massive stumbling block. In other words, the original controversy surrounding Jesus wasn't the same argument that dominates the conversation today. And I want to move forward a bit because a lot of people don't realize that one of the greatest rabbis in Jewish history, Rabbi Akiva, publicly identified Bar Kokhba as the Messiah, which is really interesting, especially if we apply that same standard that I made in the beginning of the video, which is basically today's standard. Did Bar Kokhba bring world peace? No. Did he gather the exiles? No. Did he rebuild the temple? Nope. Did he establish universal knowledge of God? No. None of those things happened. Yet Rabbi Akiva still believed he was the Messiah, and enough people believed as well, they felt confident enough to start a revolt against Rome. Why? Because the standard was not complete every prophecy first, then we'll decide if you're Messiah. The expectation was that the Messiah would accomplish those things. Notice the difference. Akiva recognized Bar Kokhba before the mission was completed, but when Jesus is discussed today, many people apply a very different standard. The mission must already be completed, every prophecy must be already fulfilled. Only then can we discuss whether he's the Messiah or not. But that's not the standard that Rabbi Akiva used. And honestly, I think that's a fair question to ask. If those things disqualify Jesus, why didn't they disqualify Bar Kokhba? Bar Kokhba wasn't disqualified because he didn't fulfill those things. He was disqualified because he was killed in battle and lost the revolt. Now, before someone says, but this is exactly what Judaism teaches, well, let's talk about that for a moment. One reason this argument became so influential is because of a rabbi who lived more than 1,000 years after Jesus, and his name is Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. Most people know him as Rambam or Maimonides. Rambam is one of the most respected and influential rabbis in Jewish history, and in his Mishnah Torah, he lays out criteria for identifying the Messiah. The Messiah will rebuild the temple, the Messiah will gather the exiles, the Messiah will restore Israel, and Rambam says if a candidate dies before accomplishing these things, he's not the Messiah. Now, to be fair, Rambam didn't invent these prophecies. The prophecies absolutely speak about restoration, peace, and the gathering of Israel. But what Rambam did was organize those prophecies into a formal test for identifying the Messiah. And because Rambam became so influential, his framework became the framework many Jews today. In fact, there's a good chance that when someone gives me this argument on the streets of Jerusalem, they're not actually quoting Isaiah or Jeremiah, Ezekiel or Zechariah. They're repeating an interpretation that was systemized by a rabbi writing in the 1100s, over 1,000 years after Jesus. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not attacking Rambam. I'm just simply asking a simple question. Is Rambam giving the Bible's explicit test for identifying the Messiah, or is he giving us his interpretation of how these prophecies should be applied? Because those aren't the same thing. And that's why I keep coming back to the same question. Where in the Tanakh does it say that if the Messiah dies before completing these tasks, he's automatically disqualified? I can find that requirement in Rambam, but I can't seem to find it in the Bible. So now I want to go a little bit deeper. Where does the Tanakh actually say this? Okay, not a rabbi, not a commentary, not a tradition. Where does the Bible say if the Messiah dies before bringing world peace, he's not the Messiah? And if you can give me the chapter and verse, put it down in the comment sections. I've been looking for it. Where does it say if the temple isn't rebuilt during his lifetime, he cannot be the Messiah? Chapter and verse, put it down in the comment section. Where does it say if all the exiles are not gathered, he's disqualified? The answer is, it doesn't. People often point to passages describing the messianic age, and yes, they're right to point to them. Isaiah describes peace, the prophets describe restoration, the nations coming to know God, of course. And we can actually see some of these being fulfilled today, where we have billions of non-Jewish people from all over the world throughout history believing in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because of Jesus, and they're reading the Old Testament. Universal knowledge of the Torah. But here's a difference between describing what the Messiah ultimately accomplishes and describing how people identify him. Those aren't the same question. So let me give you an example. When King David was anointed king, was Israel already at peace? No. Were all of God's promises to David already fulfilled? No. Did that mean he wasn't king? Of course not. He was king before the mission was completed. Or think about Moses. Imagine an Israelite saying Moses can't be God's deliverer. Why? Because we're still slaves. Pharaoh is still on the throne. We're still in Egypt. Technically, all of those things were true. But nobody would conclude from that Moses wasn't God's chosen deliverer. His mission wasn't complete yet. Now, throughout the Bible, God's chosen leaders are often recognized before their work is finished. Yet when it comes to Jesus, many people insist on a completely different standard. And here's what fascinates me. The same scripture that describes a reigning Messiah also describes a suffering one. Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, Zechariah 12, Psalm 118. Those passages exist and they have to be explained. The Messiah suffers. The Messiah is rejected. The Messiah is pierced, wounded. The Messiah is despised and rejected. Why aren't those part of the checklist? Why do we hear about world peace, but not Isaiah 53? Why do we hear about the temple, but not Psalm 22? Why do we hear about the gathering of the exiles, but not Zechariah 12? The scriptures contain both themes, suffering and glory, rejection and reign. And those themes come together in one Messiah. First suffering, then glory. First rejection, then reign. This is the biblical pattern. You may agree with it, you may disagree, but you can't pretend the suffering passages aren't there. They are, and they deserve just as much attention as the passages about peace and restoration. So when someone tells me Jesus can't be the Messiah because he didn't bring world peace, my response is this: that's true. The world is not at peace, but that's not really the question. The question is, does the Bible teach that the Messiah must accomplish every messianic promise before he can be identified as the Messiah? And I don't find scripture ever saying that. In fact, Jewish history doesn't seem to say that either. Rabbi Akiva didn't use that standard with Bar Kokhba. The Bible doesn't apply that standard to David. It doesn't apply that standard to Moses. And nowhere in the Tanakh do I find a verse that says, if the Messiah has not completed everything immediately, he can't be the Messiah. What I do find are prophecies about a Messiah who suffers, a Messiah who's rejected, a Messiah who bears the sins of others, a Messiah who comes before the destruction of the second temple. And those are questions every honest seeker should wrestle with. So maybe the real question isn't, did Jesus fulfill everything? I believe the real question is, what did he fulfill? And once you start asking that question, you might find there's a lot more to this discussion than the simple checklist most of us have heard. Open the scriptures. Read Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, Daniel 9, Zechariah 12, and read the New Testament, and then decide. Because the Messiah is way too important of a subject to settle with slogans. Let's go back to the scriptures and see where the evidence leads. And yes, you found my YouTube channel, Highway 53. So subscribe, like the video, leave your comments in the comment section, and stay tuned for more videos just like this.